Okay, I think we'll make a start now. So thank you very much to everyone who's been able to join today. Really excited to kick off today's event. My name is Henry Phillipson. I work at a venture capital firm called Berengier, but you may also know me through being one of the co-founders of ESGVC. For those of you who haven't joined our events previously, we're an organisation that seeks to help startups to measure and improve their ESG performance. So more than 200 VC firms across the UK and Europe participating in this network. If you're ever looking for further information on that, feel free to get in touch with me directly, either through LinkedIn, or I will leave my email address for you in the chat today. So we've got a really exciting session looking at the environmental footprint of startups and how to reduce their impact on the environment. So I'll be handing over to Fran van Dijk in a moment, who is today's chair, who will introduce herself properly, I'm sure. And then we've got a really exciting panel of perspectives from startups and law and investor to talk about how we can all manage the carbon footprint of high growth businesses. We'll have the chat open, so there'll be lots of opportunity for people to participate. So please do leave comments for us in the chat, and we will we'll be able to address those questions later on in the event. So thank you very much, everyone, and over to you, Fran.
Thanks very much, Henry, and thanks for having me. I'm Fran van Dijk, and I'm CEO of One Stone Advisors. And I'm really looking forward to hearing all your questions about carbon reduction strategies for venture-backed businesses, which is our topic of the day. First of all, just want to welcome our brilliant panel. So we have Laura Pedro-Peronin from the VC Astronaut, and their focus is on where tech meets nature, with the aim of accelerating regenerative agriculture, really important area. We have Ed from Artus, a buildings heating and cooling innovator, aiming to significantly reduce energy use. And Charlotte from Metricus, which builds software to aggregate your space data, making buildings more cost efficient, energy efficient, and time efficient. And we know the built environment is a major emitter, so that's a really good space to be. So a little intro to my company and perhaps why I'm here, giving you a few quick takeaways on your carbon reduction strategy. So One Stone, we're a team of international sustainability experts, and we help companies to become more effective sustainability leaders. So we're really interested in that leadership innovation space. We've been doing this for a couple of decades, so we've seen a huge amount of change in that time, and also a shift in focus on topics like climate change. So a little bit about us. We're the first female-led B Corp in the UK. We're about to celebrate the 10th anniversary of our certification. That's pretty exciting, planning a big party. We work with all kinds of companies, from huge multinationals like Ericsson to SME. And I advise the board of 2 startups, both of whom have a kind of ESG focus. Increasingly, though, we work for the financial sector, particularly private equity and their portfolio companies. And I realise that's a bit away from where you are, but and they, they're bigger than you. But what they're interested in right now is going to be what they're interested in about you in years to come. So it's worth you thinking about similar things that they're looking at. And you'll all be aware that of the ESGVC framework that help you set up relevant KPIs. That's such a brilliant starting point. And further down the line, you might consider becoming a B Corp, because that also gives you a really good set of credentials that investors are looking for. So what benefits do some of our clients get from the advice that we give? And particularly because of today's topic on climate. Well, the first thing is finding cheap money, actually. So we did some analysis for a PE firm called Triton of all their fund carbon data. And what our analysis did is it actually allowed them to show that the longer they owned a company, the better its carbon performance. And they'd never done this analysis before, so it was a real revelation to them. And what's the significance of that work? Well, it enabled them to get, and in fact, it was instrumental in them securing an ESG-linked lower interest loan from a consortium of 5 banks. The lead bank was RBS, and the amount was 1.5 billion euros. It was literally the biggest thing pretty much that happened to them that year. So you can see that if you get your data right, if you track your performance and get your data right, it can be financially extremely beneficial. The second way we help is to do with attracting and retaining the best talent. So good, accurate ESG and climate related stories are a really good way to attract potential hires and connect with them. So one client of ours found that 80% of new hires coming for interview use their sustainability report as the main source of information about the company. And it really helped them swing the attractiveness of their company to those applicants. So write your story well, track your progress carefully, set up a relevant suite of great KPIs as soon as you can, and get used to using the information in a really attractive way. So a few tips from me on the kinds of things you can do now, and you're going to get loads more pearls of wisdom from our panel. The first thing is start measuring your carbon footprint. And just to get a little bit geeky, broadly, the carbon footprint is made up of 3 elements or scopes, and these are designed by something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the way that pretty much everybody measures their footprints. Scope 1 is the fuel that you use in your operations. So it might be diesel or gas, and it's more relevant in terms of its implications for a company using this kind of energy to make stuff, like a manufacturer. It's more likely that scope 1 emissions will be big for them. It's more likely that your scope 1 emissions will be quite small, maybe related to gas for heating or something. Scope 2 is your purchased electricity and steam, heat or cooling. So that's something that's more likely to be bigger for you, your scope 2 emissions, if you're using a lot of electricity anyway. And scope 3, which is likely actually to be your biggest set of emissions, are those from your supply chain, for instance, travel emissions as well, and also the emissions that are emitted using your products by customers. So therefore, the efficiency of your products in use is very important, as well as getting those products to the customers. So scope 3 is often much larger than your scope 1 and 2 emissions, and because you're not directly able to measure it, because it's other people's emissions, it's often harder to get information on. And I think Ed will be filling us in on that a little bit later. So how do you manage your carbon footprint? Well, basically, once you've measured it and got the numbers, you can plug your baseline figures into a spreadsheet and manage it from there. But if you're anything other than tiny, you probably want to go one step more sophisticated than that. And for instance, you can go to websites where you can plug in your data and they'll calculate your carbon footprint for you. And for you guys, you can get this done for free. One company I know of is one called, it's a B Corp again, called Compare Your Footprint. And they will offer you a free carbon footprint for any company with a turnover of less than £300,000. So probably quite a few of you can get a free carbon footprint from them. I have to declare an interest. It's one of the companies that I sit on the advisory board of, and other carbon footprinters are available, but Green Element are pretty good and well known. So another thing I'd like you to think about is that carbon management and carbon reduction is about more than greenhouse gas emissions. So increasingly, scientists and the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, they recognise that nature plays an incredibly important part in the climate challenge, because soil, plants and trees are vital carbon dioxide stabilisers. And in fact, some research scientists that I work with are arguing that soil is so precious as a carbon sink that we shouldn't be growing food in it at all, because generally agriculture is very disturbing to the soil structure. And unless you're doing regenerative agriculture, you might find that you're doing making the soil release carbon rather than absorb it. So do be aware that investors are now looking very hard at nature-based risk in their investments. So understanding how much your business relies on nature, for instance, as many FMCG companies do, is really essential. Understanding that risk and attempting to measure it and mitigate it. Another thing I'd like to highlight to you, and there's only 2 more, is get to grips with your digital footprint. Most of you will be really tech-based, but I doubt that you know how big your digital carbon footprint is. And the way that your social website works, how it's designed, and also how your social media is designed, can have a huge impact on the energy consumption of your site and your own energy consumption, but also that of your users. So there are companies who specialize in helping you here. One is called Whole Grain Digital, another B Corp, good friend of ours, and it's the don't put on their advisory board though. It's the go-to place to understand your digital footprint and do something about it. So here's an example. They recently redid a website for the UK Green Building Council, and they reduced the grams of CO2 generated from a single page per visit from 1.36 grams, one page, one visit, to 0.24 grams, the same page for one visit. So that's a big reduction. It's like a whole gram per page. And over the whole project, which included moving the site to a green host, so data center run by renewable energy, the CO2 emitted was reduced by a factor of 16. And they give an example on their website. So if you were driving a car, standard car, that's like the difference in emissions between now, which is like driving 103 miles for the whole website, to before it was 1,649. So they really had a radical change, and the website still looks great. So go check it out. And the final really easy switch you can do is to switch to a green electricity provider. So try Ecotricity or try Good Energy. They are a bit more expensive, but they can guarantee all renewable energy going through your system, or at least renewable electricity. Good Energy does actually do a proportion of green gas. So that's a little intro from me, a few tips for you to pick up on, a few sites for you to visit. And I'm going to ask the panel a few questions about their experiences with reducing their own carbon and those of their clients. So Laura, I'm coming to you first of all from Astanor. I know that you've done a lot of work on measuring your own carbon footprint and also your portfolio companies. And that's a pretty enormous undertaking, I think. And I was just wondering if you'd introduce Astanor and describe how you went about collecting all this data, and any surprises, good or bad, that you had on the way?
Definitely a bit of both. So Astanor is a VC impact fund specialized in the agri-food sector, and the agri-food sector today representing over a third of the greenhouse gas emissions as a sector. It is all the more important that we are able to measure our carbon footprint and that of our portfolio company to then support them in scaling with the right processes in place to make sure that they limit as much as possible their greenhouse gas emissions. So the way we've done it this year is that we've onboarded with an online platform called a tool called Sweep, which is a French company. And they supported us in calculating our carbon footprint, which measures that of Astanor as a corporate company, but also of our business. And that's the category Scope 3, category 15, which are our financed emissions. So the emissions of our portfolio companies. Today, we've got 40 portfolio companies, ranging from seed to Series E. And obviously the work and the carbon emissions of a tiny company, a seed tiny company, and a Series E company is completely different. And what we found is that we can't, to date, because these companies are scaling, it's extremely difficult to set reduction targets for them, but it's really important to start by getting them to properly measure their carbon footprint. And so that way they can identify where their biggest emissions category is. And as you mentioned, is most of the time in their Scope 3. Just the same way that Astanor's biggest carbon footprint is our Scope 3, meaning our financed emissions. And what we discovered this year is that, one, measuring your carbon footprint is really an exercise that takes time. the data that we've gathered this year is full of imperfections and assumptions and rough estimates, and that's fine. Because ultimately we've learned so much during this process, and we're going to really be able to, share with our portfolio companies all of these findings to make sure that they are able to put in place the right processes for next year. And one of the first processes to put in place is actually learning from this data gathering process and being able to streamline from an accounting perspective how the data is recorded into their system. So typically your expenses should be listed, using the names of each of the categories, for instance. And the other main finding that we had is that it's so important to be able to record data in physical value rather than monetary value. What I mean by this is that rather than recording the fact that you spent, 50,000 euros on flights during the year, it's so much more important to be able to say, my companies flew 50,000 kilometers during the year, because the emissions factors for physical data is so much more accurate. And what we discovered when doing that is that we managed to have a total carbon footprint related to our flights that was 10 times smaller than if we had used our monetary values, because of the accuracy of the emissions factor. The other finding that we discovered is that it's not always possible for companies to be able to record to measure their carbon footprint for every single one of their categories, because the data is difficult to get. So what happens in this case, according to if we follow the greenhouse gas protocol, is that every category for which the data hasn't been input, there is a substitution that is used based on the CDP market averages. So if I take an example, we've got a US company who's doing coating of fruits to protect fruits from degrading and preventing food loss. So that CDP category, the one that we had selected, was initially chemical materials. And so for every category of scope 1, 2, and 3 that they weren't able to fill, the CDP estimates were replacing the data. And so it gave us, for that specific sector, what companies were emitting on average. So you were able to get an overall idea of what the carbon footprint of our company was. But what we discovered is that within that CDP average, actually the category was emitting so much more than what a small scale company like ours was doing. So the CDP average, I don't have the exact figure, but it was something, if you take an order of magnitude, the CDP average sector was emitting 100 tons of CO2 per company, and our company, realistically being so small, was probably emitting only 2 tons of CO2 per year, but it got allocated an average of 100 because that's what the CDP average was. And so this is when we discovered that it was so important now going forward for companies to start measuring really each one of those categories, so that they don't get allocated averages that are really not reflective of their businesses. And the last final challenge that we've had is actually on the allocation key, because for our finance categories, as an investor, what we take as our financed emissions is not the totality of our portfolio companies' emissions, it's only the share of our investments. But that the calculation that we've used was based on the PCAF methodology. And that PCAF methodology was requiring us to collect quite a lot of financial data that's not always very obvious to collect for small scaling companies, notably the debt and the fair value of the debt. And that's been a really big challenge for us to actually allocate a projected value of what that debt would mean, which ultimately means that our allocation key isn't the most accurate, and we're also going to have to work with companies on getting more accurate data on the financial information.
Well, I just
yeah.
wanted to thank you. Thank you so much for really pinning down, actually, when you get down to the nitty-gritty of it, with the complexity of an organization like yours, how important it is to have your own data rather than relying on averages.
Absolutely.
That seems to have shone through incredibly. Can you just touch on some of the advantages you've had from doing the work that you've done? Because I think it's quite daunting, you know, as a newbie coming in, listening to this. Can you just highlight some of the good things that have come out of it?
The good thing is that now we have a much better accurate idea for us as a company of where are our biggest emissions, which company is the most emitting, and therefore which company we should really be working with so that we can identify for reduction strategies. So typically, can they replace their sources of energy with renewable energy? That's with our portfolio companies. But on our side as well, we've learned that our travel emissions are quite high. So how can we look at reducing them, including on flights? You know, we have often taken flights that were connecting. And instead of doing that, we're going to be looking at doing direct flights that are much less emitting. So there's been like really a great learning process in this, in terms of like, how do we ultimately collectively engage us and our portfolio companies and other stakeholders into reducing our carbon emissions.
Great, thank you so much, super helpful, and you'll have provided some shortcuts for some of the people listening. I'm going to ask the panel a couple more questions, well, a couple of questions, one question each, and then come to your questions that are coming in now. So don't worry, we're not ignoring you. We'll get there. Thanks, Laura. Ed, I wanted to turn to you next, because you produce products which help clients reduce their carbon impacts in heating and cooling. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, especially how that conversation with clients has changed over time, the sort of topics that have, on the climate-related topics that have shifted over time. And also at the other end of the value chain, in terms of your suppliers, what challenges are you coming across getting carbon data from them?
Sure, thanks. So Artist, we've been going about 2 years now as our own entity, although the product's been on the market for about 5 with a partnership before we span out into our own VC journey. The product was invented by my colleague Roger about 10 years ago, and it was innovation in a relatively stale construction sector. And Roger's whole driver of inventing the product, was reducing operational energy. That was the biggest conversation 10 years ago in building design. You know, how could we reduce the electricity bills and gas bills, etc. Since the product sort of inception and where we are now, the market has changed rapidly. We have seen significant growth in the interest around embodied carbon, about reuse of buildings, about waste on site, etc. And really, it's been quite a quick shift, I've got to say, in the grand scheme of when you think of a building design life of 100 years, maybe, or 75 years, and the design process to refurbish or build a building can be anywhere from 1 year to 5 years. In the last 2 years, this topic's moved right up that agenda. And in operational energy and carbon, I think there's quite a good understanding in the industry around how to measure it. Whether people do is a different matter, but actually what we should be measuring and how we measure it. And I think a lot of that low-hanging fruit in the industry has been done. You know, switching the light bulbs to LED, if optimizing plant. There's still huge amounts more work to be done, but a lot of those gains are being achieved. And now people are very much looking towards a whole life carbon analysis, which includes the embodied upfront carbon. And that's one of the aspects of our product, which actually is most attractive to people, along with some of the other features and benefits. The other driver in the marketplace in terms of air conditioning where we operate is refrigerant-based systems and water-based systems. Refrigerant-based systems, which you may know names of Mitsubishi or Daikin, etc. in the industry, have all the refrigerants in there with fancy R names. They quite often have a high global warming potential products in there, and the EU legislation, which the UK is mimicking, despite Brexit, is really to phase them down very quickly by 2035 and take them out of buildings as far as they can, as well as other industries such as commercial refrigeration. So there's an interesting driver there moving towards water-based air conditioning. There's an interesting driver around embodied carbon. And we're seeing a big, I guess, driver from consultants who primarily are the decision makers in building design for information from us. And we, despite being a very low energy and low embodied carbon product, struggle to give them really good quality data. And that's because we're beholden to our supply chain. So our product has a bill of materials of maybe 150 components. We buy from maybe 70 or 80 suppliers, or rather we buy through an OEM route. So to say that we actually buy a final product and we manufacture in a separate factory. But getting to the granularity of that supply chain, understanding where that bit of metal comes from, where that electronic component comes from, what energy's gone into that, you know, has it come halfway across the world or just come across the fence from the next door factory, is very difficult, and we don't have that data. So we are estimating it at present, and that's the best we can do until the whole supply chain we operate within, because we are a startup, we're not a big player, moves and gets that data and becomes comfortable with sharing that data as well, because there are elements of commercial tension there, if you know where materials are sourced, etc. We're not going to get to a great place, but we, like a lot of other manufacturers in our industry, are trying to achieve what's called EPDs, the Environmental Product Declaration Certificates, which is an independently verified document. But that's a huge investment for us. You know, that's going to cost us probably in the tens of thousands and probably take quite some months to get that done, all things being well. So in reality, I think the timescales will be longer. But our customers are demanding it, and we're trying to fulfill it as best we can. But we are struggling with that journey. Does that answer the question, Fran?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's thank you for that. That's really enlightening, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call will come across similar challenges. And I think we're going to see the quality of that data really rocket in the next few years. So I hope your pain is short-lived. but so thanks very much. I'm going to move now on to Charlotte from Matrix, and Charlotte, you offer software solutions that help clients manage their buildings more efficiently. So you're helping them reduce their carbon, but also you've been on your own carbon reduction journey, haven't you? Maybe you could tell everyone a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So about 2 years ago, we joined Tech Zero, which is a kind of organization that helps startups commit to sort of getting on that net zero journey. And it has been very enlightening for us. So I'd 100% recommend it to anyone who's kind of starting out on this journey. There's a lot of great resources there. And then from there, we kind of had to make a plan. Okay, we've now committed, but what do we do to get there? And I think one of the most practical tips I could probably give is to have a committee. We set up a committee internally, which had kind of every different level of stakeholders. So from the C-suite down to sort of the lowest level in the organization, and across every department as well, because really this journey is very holistic, and it is going to take every department to kind of get involved in it to help move the needle. So that I would 100% recommend, and that's really helped us to move in a positive direction quickly. And then just thinking about other sort of practical tips that we have implemented. Greenr is an employee app, so we have people working in the office, but we also have people working remotely, and that can be quite difficult to measure exactly, you know, how much emissions are like being put out from the office and then how much is remote. And this app, which I can send in the chat later, really helps to get that information from employees, and is also engaging, and allows like a bit of competition in between employees as well, to help sort of reduce some of your emissions there. And then we looked at sort of more of the low-hanging fruit, so things like checking like your BMS, so how if you're in an office, like checking your building. A lot of the time these systems are running 24/7 when they just don't need to be. I'm sure Ed would be able to comment on that as well, that often if there's a bank holiday or you know everyone's away for Christmas, the building's still running at full emissions and there's nobody there, which seems silly and is a very quick win. So looking at stuff like that. And then I know that someone mentioned business travel earlier. This is another difficult one for us. I mean, 2 years ago when we started this journey, we were 6 people. We're now about 55. Looks quite different in terms of our emissions and our output. So we had to look at some of those areas that were growing and how we can kind of minimize those before we try and neutralize with offsetting. So we actually were looking at a company called Stays, which they allow you to compare the emissions that hotels have, just like you would compare price. So some of these sort of more practical companies that are all within the Tech Zero network really helped us to kind of accelerate our journey essentially, and help us learn all the kind of jargon that we needed to know to get to the right place.
Thanks so much. And there's so many great tips there. I mean, one is don't try and do this alone, right? Get a group of people to do it in the organisation from all parts of it, because it does penetrate everything. And also, if you are asking people to take this on, give them time to do it. Don't ask them to do it in addition to everything else they do. Allocate time to people who are given this responsibility, and preferably write it into their job description so they can get assessed on it at the end of the year and get rewarded for the hard work.
And especially like,
sorry, carry on.
Oh, sorry, just to add on to that point there. I would definitely recommend getting HR involved, because there is a lot of policies that you will need to implement to kind of move this forward. So that's my key point.
Great. So it is a real human and cultural challenge. It's not just an environmental one, right? You mentioned an app you use that helps you understand people's emissions at home as well as at work. And that ties in really, really well to a question we've had at the beginning, which is how do companies with mainly remote workers approach a carbon calculation for them? And I'm sure you'll have something to say about this as well, or perhaps everyone on the panel. But Charlotte, how does that app help?
So what it does is, I don't have any affiliation as well with it, by the way. It's just really helpful for us. And what it does is essentially quizzes everyone in the company on, you know, their travel to work. So do they cycle? Do they get the tube? And then also, you know, how often are they in the office? How often are they at home? Are they 100% remote? Do they use renewable energy? Do they not? So all of the questions that you would need to know, it just has it there for you. So you don't need to kind of think about what they are, and it collates the data. And then, as I say, you can sort of start to run like competitions to kind of start to do some reduction policies as well. So yeah, it's just a really helpful way to engage people in something which may be seen as a bit of a chore.
And Laura, do you have experience with measuring home-related emissions?
Yeah, and that's been super challenging. We've got one company still in the US who only does office home work. Actually, they don't have an office, so there was no commuting, and so what we did there is that there is an average emissions factor that Sweep provided us with that was per FTE, and was measuring, I can't remember I had exactly what the amount of the emissions factor was, but it was measuring basically the waste, the energy use, the heating, cooling for the energy use, ventilation, the lighting, the devices, the internet, all of that was covered in that one average emissions factor. So again, we see here kind of the limitation of not having accurate data, but that would mean like the next step would then for employees to then themselves calculate their own individual emissions factor, if you want, and that's a whole new process to put in place.
Thank you so much. Yeah, our complicated lives make this carbon calculation a bit more complicated in itself, don't they? There's another question for you, Laura, which is about your methodology for getting more accurate data. And the question is, how do you show and how do you know that the changes that you've applied that allowed you to measure your carbon footprint more accurately were the right choices? Since the previous data you had was purely based on industry averages and therefore, not accurate for you, but biased. So how do you show you've got it right this time? Is it just an experiment? You try one thing, you try another thing, or it's probably not a straightforward answer.
Well, the one thing I can say is that we've had an amazing employee who spent time looking at all of our emissions factor and finding the most accurate one, and that takes a lot of time. So you need to have a dedicated team to do that. And he really went through a list of, I don't know how many hundreds of emissions factors to pin down, what's the right one for that specific category. And also running around and going to every single person. So that was HR, travel agency, assistants, accountants, to go get the data and try to basically say, okay, so typically if I take again that example of the flights where we had some of our flights reported in euro value rather than kilometers, in some of the cases we could go back to a travel agency to say, can you give us a more accurate breakdown of the flights? But in some cases we couldn't, so we had to do proxies and say, we know that most of our flights are Paris or Brussels to New York. We know that the average flight from Paris to New York is returned 2 tons. And so we had to build proxies to get accurate. And then to replace, I think ultimately what's going to be really interesting is saying from this year to next year, how our data is going to be improving. That's really where I think we'll be able to showcase the work that we've done with our portfolio companies. And this year to say, this is what our carbon footprint looks like. We know for sure that it's completely inflated, but this is what it's going to be looking like next year.
Yeah. And then you can start reducing it from there. And also, if people aren't used to doing carbon footprints, then there are different amount, you have to calculate the different carbon emissions for what class you travel. So if you travel, cabin, business, or first class, each of those have very different emissions associated because of the amount of space you're taking up in the aircraft. So it's a good incentive not to travel business class if you care for your carbon footprint. So we have another question, which all of you might want to input into. Let's see who offers. And it says, many of our portfolio companies lease office or manufacturing space or work from co-working spaces and don't have transparency into their energy use or associated emissions. Any tips for companies who are working in that kind of space? What do you do about that? Does anyone have any experience of it, want to volunteer? You've all got your own offices.
I feel like I'm kind of monopolizing it, but we do have experience in that as well. So we actually, the way we did proxies there before ourselves, because we've got a Brussels office where we have our own leased space so that we can control what our energy consumption is, but we also have a co-working space in Paris. And typically the co-working team came back, or the co-workers manager came back to us saying, we only have the overall consumption for the whole building. But then they also told us that, the average surface of the building was 1,000 square meters, for instance, I don't remember. And the number of people sat in that office. So we could calculate the average consumption per square meter of the office and take our share of that. We knew we had I don't know, 20, no, probably more than that, like 60 meters square of that office. So we did a proxy saying we'll take a share of the total energy consumption of the office.
Yeah, and I think another complication of those co-working spaces is you don't have any control over where they buy their energy from. So you can't say, oh yeah, we've got 100% green energy. if that's not what they're using and you can't persuade them to buy it. So that can be a bit of a tricky one if you're looking to reduce your emissions. Okay, I've got a question here about cloud services. So what would you recommend would be the approach for measuring the footprint of software companies who rely on cloud providers, e.g. AWS, Azure, for their products platform, which is hosted? Can we take credit for the renewable energy initiatives of cloud providers from whom we purchase infrastructure?
I'm happy to take this one. We actually kind of encountered this on our journey as well. So I think it's a really good point. We actually used to be hosted on AWS, and we recently made the transition over to Azure because of this reason. So Azure have committed to being 100% renewable energy by 2025. So because of their commitment to sustainability, we've also partnered with them. And it's given us actually a lot of sort of business advantage as well. So being hosted on them and being part of their sustainability partner, it's allowed for a lot of sort of business development opportunities in their sort of sustainability space as well. So that's been really interesting. And then we're also looking at the Green Software Foundation principles. So that's kind of there's a policy outlined or principles outlined in which software companies can look at and sort of start to follow how they can reduce their emissions that are created by software.
That's really interesting, Charlotte. Thanks for that. I wasn't expecting such a straightforward answer, so brilliant.
Well, maybe it's not so straightforward in principle, but those are kind of the key points that we focused on.
Yeah, no, well, it's great, and you brought up something else which I think is really helpful, is that those partnerships you can build through initiatives like that, and that is, you know, you learn together, you exchange information, you give each other good tips, and so the people that come after you can learn that much faster than you did. And I think in this space that's happening a lot. So don't underestimate the value of those networks in exchanging information and support. Okay, got a question here from Margot. What is the best practice for comparing data year on year? Another one for Laura, and actually for all of you, because Ed, you'll have this as well. Best practice for comparing data year on year when you're constantly learning new things and refining data every year, probably redefining boundaries and that kind of thing. So you may not be able to compare apples with apples. And I know that everyone I work with, I mean, they are restating data boundaries, even, restating their baselines sometimes to just, because of this very fact that the information that's coming in is changing so much. Is there a single best practice approach, or is the best thing just to be as transparent as you can about how your initiatives are developing over time? So,
I'm not sure I'm following 100% the question. Is it to say how are we comparing data year on year and how it's improving? Because
well, how it's changed, because how can you compare it when things are changing so much? You know, the way you calculate it, for instance, is changing so much, and you're refining it.
I mean, ultimately, we're still going to be comparing tons of CO2 emissions with tons of CO2 emissions. So to me, if anything, your emissions are just going to reduce. It might not, the tricky thing is like your overall carbon footprint is going to be reducing the better your data gets, but it's not necessarily meaning that your carbon emissions are going to be, that your ultimate absolute carbon emissions are actually reducing. It could just be that you have more precise data. So typically going from a market average CDP to your own carbon footprint, and that could go from divide by 100. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, what is interesting to look at, especially for small startups, is to say, rather than looking at your absolute carbon emissions, which is not super significant, what is interesting is to look at your carbon intensity per FTE or per revenue and comparing it to companies in the same sector, because in our sector, impossible for us to compare a Nestle or a Danone with one of our companies because their absolute emissions are going to be so much bigger. But comparing the intensity per FTE and making sure that that intensity at least stays the same, or at least or I mean, in the best case scenario, reduces, is a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
And sorry, I also have a question about the servers, but we can go back to it because I do need some insights on how to do with the AWS. So happy to go back to it when if we have some time.
Great. Charlotte, someone's asking you about your the server you used.
Yeah, I think I just replied. So we moved from AWS to Microsoft Azure.
Fantastic. What does it say? Because Good Energy and Ecotricity aren't signing up to new contracts. What recommend? Who would you recommend, since Good Energy and Ecotricity seem to be fully occupied? Who would be your next favourite providers of renewable energy?
Tricky. Well, I personally use Octopus and I think it's really good, but I don't know whether they are signing people up at the minute.
Anyone else? Anyone else on Octopus or others? No? Okay, that looks like it's the favourite. So, are there further questions that maybe Law, you wanted to ask a little bit about servers and platforms, AWS you mentioned, so we could perhaps go a little bit further on that one.
Yeah, so I guess it's a question for Charlotte, because we have all of our software companies are currently with AWS, and they've tried to engage with with Amazon. And there is a portal. We're not on it actually, so I don't really know how it works, but they were able to give us like a dashboard of what the avoided emissions were, which didn't mean much. It was ultimately saying your emissions are 0 because it's all powered by renewable energy and you've avoided 2.5 tons of emissions. Very difficult to go verify that statement. We don't really know what's behind. And so we're actually looking to see if we can engage with Amazon on this topic. I'm thinking that coalition, it would be great if we could have the name of it, the green tool.
It's in here somewhere, but I can send it to you after as well and make sure that everyone's got it. I think Henry, you might have shared it, the principles, but yeah, we found essentially as well with ours, like we found that Amazon were less forthcoming and like it was more difficult to partner with them on solutions, whereas when we moved to Microsoft, we've had a lot of support from them in terms of growing us and also growing our use of their servers. So yeah, and I know they've committed to the 100% renewable energy by 2025, and there was also another stat somewhere about I'll get it right here. They've aimed to be water positive and zero waste by 2030 as well. So I think that it was just for us the clarity over sort of what their goals were and their commitment to sustainability, which kind of swung it for us. And obviously that's part of kind of a large part of our scope 3. So it was important.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Charlotte. We've got a completely different question here. My startup company works in clean tech, developing improved solutions for renewables adoption. Do you suggest we integrate the impact of our product in the market with the impact of our own operations, or would these be treated separately? So this is a scopes question, isn't it? So who wants to go for it?
I'm happy to go, but I don't know how it would be. But I would say yes. So we always talk about both of ours in conjunction, because we help people reduce their emissions while we're also trying to reduce ours. So I guess it's sort of carbon avoidance in a sense. So I would say yes, definitely. And I think that they kind of benefit each other as well. But Laura, you might have a different opinion or some value to add there.
So I just wanted to bring Ed in here, because your products also help reduce emissions amongst your customers. Do you have any way of accounting for those, or kind of measuring them or including them, or are you interested in doing that?
We do need to be. I mean, our our emissions of us as a company is our scope 1s and 2s and directs are quite low. It's all within our products. So we do have tools, it's called TM65, which quantifies the kilograms of CO2 in our product when a customer receives it. Again, it's a precursor to what I mentioned in terms of the EPD. So it's a bit rough and ready, but I suppose in reference to one of the questions earlier, you've got to start somewhere in collecting the data. It may not be perfect. And changing baselines in reporting or figures changing is part of life as a startup. If it wasn't, then you'd never get anywhere. It's paralysis by analysis. Some data's at least to start. So we very much focus, especially in our external sell, really, and our communication to our customers and consultants on the exact product, and that is the majority of what our impact is the product. It's a funny industry, ours, because we give the raw data to the consultants. They will do their analysis and tell their client, their building developer, how much energy that's going to save or carbon. And it's fascinating to see what comes back. It really is fascinating. So we are just a facilitator to external consultants doing their work, and our own internal impacts are really quite small at this point. I've learned a lot today because we're really at the beginning of our journey of measuring our own impact of transport and stuff. So hearing to Laura and Charlotte is really, really interesting, and there's lots of good tips I'm going to take away today. We're sort of been so focused on our product and the impacts of our application, we've been too busy doing that rather than measuring our own information, which we will be looking at. But reference to one of the earlier questions also, we're in a co-working space. We rent it. We have no visibility of what their impact is of their bills. But one of the things we saw when we signed up is their B Corp. So seeing things like that, it's a badge which you're signing up to a company with similar ethics and values, I guess, of what you're trying to achieve, because these are big, complicated topics and conversations. And whilst a simple badge is always going to oversimplify things, it's at least a start. It's at least a start, so you're on the right page with who you're starting to.
Maybe they've had to answer some questions about that topic, so they've done some thinking about it, even if they're not perfect. Yeah,
exactly.
Thanks, Ed. It's really nice to know that panelists are learning from each other as well. So I hope people listening are and watching. So we have another couple of questions before we finish. This is probably one that you can all jump in on. So I'd love one tip from each of you. With limited resources for startups, what are the most effective ways to get buy-in from senior management on this carbon reduction, on your carbon reduction strategy? So I'll start with you, Ed. How do you get senior management interested?
I'm lucky because senior management is interested. However, as ever, when you're trying to do a persuasion tip, it's always trying to tell them what's the benefit to them of knowing that information. And actually, whether, exactly as you said at the beginning, Fran, it's retention. Staff hire, staff retention, that's massive. That's what senior management are interested in. Make it a benefit which they're going to understand.
Great. Laura, what about you? I mean, your senior management's quite interested as well, but how do you keep them interested?
I'd say that there's really the importance of showing them the cost benefit of doing it, especially in getting, again, the accuracy of the data. I keep going back to my example of flights, but they're totally disinterested in the reporting. They're not taking any part in the reporting of how they fly. But if we're able to show them, whether you're flying Paris to New York in business or economy, it's 2 tons or 4 tons of CO2. And then when we offset those emissions, it's going to cost us either, I can't actually remember how much we're paying for 1 ton, but you're either going to be paying 1 or 2, like 1 to double of our emissions to offset our emissions. That's a pretty powerful message that we're giving as well.
That's great. That's showing the consequences of decision making in financial terms, right? And Charlotte, what about you? Top tips for getting a top team excited?
I think mine is kind of goes similar to those and goes back to yours at the start, Fran, of like show them the money. And like I think that's the investment side of things. There's so much opportunity for investment, and I mean for us, we're going through a round of funding and we're pretty much 90% sort of sustainability funds that are looking at us just because of the work we've done. And also new business as well, like more and more customers are requesting that their supply chain is net zero or carbon neutral as well. So I think that those two things in parallel, if you can find some data on those, and once you start, I think that it just becomes more and more obvious that it's the way to go, because you start to see the kind of impact of it and how it affects the bottom line. So
thank you. And I can squeeze in one final question, which I think might be you, Ed, to start with. Any tips on how to start getting information on emissions from supply chains? I know you found it hard, but what has worked?
Finding the right partner from day one. Ask the right questions when you start to engage, and you'll quite quickly understand whether that potential partner is or isn't interested in the same values you're interested in. And probe them, keep asking. Even if someone doesn't have the data, it's the attitude around supporting you in your journey, which is probably the most important thing, because this is a dynamic environment we all work in, and it is continually changing. So attitude and want to help is half a battle.
That is such a lovely way to finish. In the end, it comes down to human beings and culture, not just climate change. And that is, after all, what we are. Humans living together on a planet which is a little bit fragile at the moment. Thank you everyone for listening so much. Henry, you might want to be wrapping up, but I want to say a big thank you to the whole panel. You've been brilliant, so interesting. I've taken away a lot. It's been such a pleasure, and thank you to the audience for the questions. Henry.
Yes, and thank you as well, Fran. That's fantastically chaired, and thank you to everyone who joined today. Feel free to check out ESGVC if you've any further questions. Contact me using the email I've just shared in the chat. Lots to follow up on, and lots of further sessions from all the questions that we've been receiving, I'm sure will come off the back of this. So thank you again to the panel, and thank you, Fran, and hope to see you all again soon.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.